the third dive was the dive, because that dive, we landed at the entrance to the grand staircase between the number 1 and number 2 stacks.
Before his time runs out, Titanic explorer Robert Ballard has admitted something he long kept buried beneath the waves. For decades, the man who found the world's most famous shipwreck carried secrets darker than rusted steel and broken chandeliers. What he finally revealed doesn't just change how we see Titanic, it changes how we see him. This isn't just a story about discovery, it's about confession, legacy, and the ghosts of the deep. Ballard's ultimate prize, the Titanic. Long before he was the man synonymous with Titanic, Robert Ballard was simply a kid who couldn't stop staring at the ocean. Born in 1942 in Wichita, Kansas, a landlocked place about as far from the sea as you can get, Ballard's fascination with water came almost paradoxically. His family later moved to San Diego, California, where the Pacific finally stretched before him, endless and unknowable. The boy who once studied maps and dreamed of adventure was suddenly living beside a vast, mysterious world that would shape his destiny. Unlike many explorers who stumble into history, Ballard was deliberate. He pursued it. He studied geology and chemistry at the University of California, Santa Barbara, then joined the U.S. Army Reserve while still young. Later, he completed a master's degree in geophysics and then pushed further, earning a doctorate in marine geology and geophysics at the University of Rhode Island. It wasn't just academic curiosity that drove him. Ballard wanted to unlock the hidden chapters of the Earth, to prove that oceans weren't just bodies of water, they were vast, undiscovered libraries of human history and planetary secrets. But here's where Ballard stood apart from other oceanographers. He wasn't content with the microscope and lab bench. He wanted machines, cameras, technology. He wanted to see what no one else had ever seen. In the 70s, while others were content to publish papers, Ballard was tinkering with robotic submersibles, dreaming up devices that could dive to crushing depths where no human diver could survive. He became part scientist, part engineer, and part showman, because Ballard knew discovery meant nothing if you couldn't bring the world along for the ride. That mix of ambition and showmanship would later make him both a celebrated hero and a controversial figure. Colleagues sometimes called him arrogant. Admirers called him brilliant. The truth? He was both. You don't find the Titanic by being modest. By the early 80s, Ballard had already built a reputation in the marine science world. He had explored deep-sea hydrothermal vents, places where boiling water gushed from cracks in the Earth's crust, creating alien-like ecosystems no one thought possible. Those discoveries shook biology to its core, proving that life could thrive without sunlight. But to the public, those achievements barely registered. Scientific journals applauded him. The average person shrugged. Ballard wanted more. He wanted a discovery that would captivate the world. Enter Titanic. The ship had been lying in darkness since April 15, 1912, when it struck an iceberg and plunged into the Atlantic with more than 1,500 souls. For decades, people speculated about its exact location. Treasure hunters dreamed of plundering it. Filmmakers fantasized about raising it from the depths, but no one had ever actually found it. The ocean is vast, and Titanic was only one ship lost among thousands. To some, searching for it was as absurd as looking for a single needle in a continent-sized haystack. But to Ballard, the Titanic wasn't just a shipwreck. It was the ultimate stage. Find it, and you wouldn't just make history, you'd become history. When he began pursuing the Titanic in earnest, Ballard wasn't just chasing science, he was chasing glory. He admitted later that he wanted to find something iconic, something that would etch his name permanently into the public consciousness. And when you look at how his career unfolded afterward, TV documentaries, books, lectures, even children's programs, you realize that Titanic wasn't just a mission, it was branding. This is what makes Robert Ballard such a fascinating figure. He wasn't only a scientist in a lab coat or a faceless Navy contractor, he was a performer. He could stand before a camera and speak with the cadence of a preacher, selling the deep sea not just as data, but as destiny. That charisma is what allowed him to attract funding, to build teams, and to push ahead on projects that others thought impossible. Without it, he might never have gotten close to Titanic. So when Ballard finally set his eyes on the infamous wreck in 1985, he wasn't just a man who stumbled across history. He was a man who had carefully positioned himself, who had spent years sharpening his tools, his team, and his image. He was ready for the moment, and he knew exactly how to use it. But here's the twist. What the public didn't know, what Ballard wouldn't reveal for decades, is that the Titanic mission wasn't exactly what it seemed. It wasn't only about discovery. It wasn't only about history. It was about secrets, military secrets, government secrets, that would only come to light much later. And those secrets change how we view the man who made Titanic his wreck. Here's the part of the story nobody expected, and the Navy never wanted you to know: the discovery of the Titanic and the secret mission behind it. On September 1st, 1985, the world changed forever, or at least, that's how the story was told. Robert Ballard and his Franco-American team announced they had found the wreck of the RMS Titanic, resting more than 2 miles beneath the North Atlantic. The headlines screamed of triumph. The greatest ship ever built had been rediscovered after more than 70 years in darkness. The world hailed Ballard as the man who had done the impossible. What the public didn't know, however, was that this discovery had a shadowy backstory. Ballard didn't simply set out to find Titanic. He was, in fact, working under the cloak of the U.S. Navy. Before Titanic ever came into the picture, the Navy had tasked him with a highly classified mission: to locate and survey 2 nuclear submarines that had sunk during the Cold War, USS Thresher and USS Scorpion. The military wanted to know whether the wrecks were leaking nuclear material or whether the Soviets had tampered with them. Ballard's state-of-the-art submersibles and remote-operated vehicles, ROVs, were the perfect tools for the job. The Navy, however, couldn't exactly announce to the world that it was scouring the ocean floor for nuclear secrets. So Ballard pitched them an idea. Let him tack on a search for Titanic after he completed the submissions. If he found it, the media would focus on that, not on the Navy's covert operations. The Navy agreed. The Titanic, in essence, was the perfect cover story. And so, when the cameras rolled and the headlines spread, the public saw only the dazzling discovery. They didn't see the military diversions, the submarine surveys, the classified reports. Ballard became the man who found Titanic, but in reality, he was also the man who shielded one of the Navy's most sensitive Cold War missions. For decades, that part of the story stayed in the shadows. When Ballard finally admitted the truth years later, some were stunned. To others, it only added to the mystique. What does it mean when the world's most famous shipwreck was rediscovered not by pure scientific pursuit, but by a Cold War bargain? It paints the Titanic's second life as less of a fairy tale and more of a geopolitical accident. Yet, despite the covert origins, the images from that 1985 dive were unforgettable. Titanic's bow emerged from the darkness like a ghost, eerily intact. The railings were still there, the anchor chains still coiled. The ship's massive size dwarfed the submersible that crept along its hull. When the team found one of the boilers, identical to those in Titanic's sister ship Olympic, they knew beyond doubt this was it. For Ballard, the moment was both professional triumph and personal vindication. He had gambled that his technology, his persistence, and his instinct would lead him to the wreck. And now, staring at Titanic's remains through a grainy video feed, he knew he had secured his legacy. The footage gripped the world. News outlets broadcast the eerie images, showing the ship that had been frozen in memory since 1912. School children watched in awe. Survivors wept. Ordinary people, who had never cared about oceanography, suddenly became obsessed with a rusty wreck 2 miles under the sea. Ballard became not just a scientist, but a celebrity, the face of a discovery that transcended disciplines and borders. Yet, here's the irony. Even in his moment of triumph, Ballard was already aware of the secrets beneath it. He knew Titanic was not just a scientific discovery. It was also a smokescreen. And perhaps that explains why, in later years, he spoke of it with a mix of pride and ambivalence. Pride, because he had found what others could not. Ambivalence, because he knew the mission had never been quite as pure as the public believed. This duality is what makes Ballard's Titanic story so compelling. On the surface, it's the greatest discovery in modern maritime history. But peel back the layers, and it becomes a tale of Cold War intrigue, secrecy, and compromise. The Titanic wasn't just a lost ship. It was the perfect diversion for a navy desperate to hide what it was really doing in the Atlantic. And in the years that followed, as Ballard's fame grew and Titanic fever swept the world, he carried that secret with him. The man the public saw was the explorer who gave Titanic back to history. The man behind the scenes was something more complicated, a scientist, a strategist, and perhaps even an unwitting pawn in a game much bigger than himself. The world reacts. Titanic fever returns. When Robert Ballard's team confirmed the wreck of Titanic in 1985, the news didn't just make headlines. It ignited a cultural explosion. Suddenly, the ship that had been entombed in silence for more than 70 years was everywhere again. The haunting images of Titanic's bow rising from the abyss became instant icons etched into the collective imagination like ghostly relics from another era. For survivors of the disaster, only a handful were still alive. The news was bittersweet. Some expressed gratitude that the ship had finally been located. Others were horrified, believing the Titanic's resting place should have remained untouched. A sacred graveyard for the 1,500 souls who perished that cold April night. Yet, whether one viewed it as triumph or desecration, the discovery forced everyone to confront the reality of Titanic's legacy all over again. Media outlets pounced. Newspapers splashed Titanic across their front pages. Television networks aired documentaries and interviews with Ballard, painting him as the explorer who had resurrected a ghost. Schools began teaching fresh lessons on the Titanic disaster, and book publishers dusted off long-forgotten accounts, rushing them back into print to feed the growing appetite for Titanic lore. Ballard himself became an overnight celebrity. He wasn't just a scientist anymore. He was a household name. Talk shows clamored for him. Magazines profiled him as a modern-day adventurer, a Jacques Cousteau for the 80s. He had achieved something that few academics ever dream of. He'd made science sexy. Kids who had never heard the word oceanography were suddenly talking about deep-sea robots and sonar. Ballard's face became synonymous with discovery itself, but with fame came controversy. Ballard insisted that Titanic should not be looted or disturbed. He called it a gravesite and urged governments to protect it. His stance clashed with salvagers and private companies who saw dollar signs in Titanic's artifacts, china plates, jewelry, pieces of the ship's grand staircase. Lawsuits soon erupted over who owned Titanic. Was it fair game, or was it sacred ground? Ballard's high-profile moral stance made him both respected and resented. Some saw him as the guardian of history. Others accused him of hypocrisy. After all, he had made his own name off of the ship's discovery. Meanwhile, Titanic fever only intensified. Ballard's discovery coincided with the rise of mass media globalization. Within months, Titanic became the subject of glossy coffee table books, primetime specials, and even merchandising. Children begged their parents for Titanic models. Historians and amateur enthusiasts flooded conferences to share theories about the iceberg collision, the lifeboat shortages, the supposed heroics and failures of the crew. Titanic wasn't just history anymore, it was pop culture. Hollywood took note. Long before James Cameron's 1997 blockbuster, there were TV movies, miniseries, and dramatizations inspired by the renewed fascination. Documentaries aired on networks like National Geographic and PBS. blending archival footage with Ballard's eerie undersea video. The Titanic had become more than a shipwreck. It was now a stage on which questions of class, hubris, tragedy, and fate could be endlessly replayed. Ballard himself leaned into this cultural moment. He co-authored books, narrated documentaries, and gave speeches to packed auditoriums. He seemed to understand that his discovery wasn't just about science, it was about storytelling, and the public couldn't get enough of it. Each interview he gave added another layer to the mythos of Titanic. He spoke with authority, but also with the aura of someone who had glimpsed another world, a graveyard beneath the sea that no ordinary person could visit. Still, the fever came at a cost. With each artifact exhibition, with each media spin-off, the line between history and spectacle grew blurrier. Ballard expressed frustration at the commercialization, but the truth is that Titanic's rediscovery opened a door that could never be closed. Once the world had seen the wreck, it wanted more, and not everyone shared Ballard's reverence for the site. The irony was stark. The very discovery that made Ballard a hero also unleashed forces he couldn't control. Titanic mania became bigger than him, bigger than science, bigger even than the ship itself. It was history transformed into entertainment, tragedy turned into tourism, and whether he liked it or not, Ballard had lit the match. In the years following 1985, Titanic's hold on the public imagination only tightened. From museums to classrooms to living rooms, the shipwreck became the ultimate symbol of human ambition and failure. And Ballard, whether willingly or reluctantly, was tethered to it. He had brought the Titanic back to life, but in doing so, he had also unleashed its ghost on the modern world. But the man who revealed Titanic's grave had one more revelation, this time about himself. The explorer's secret, what Ballard finally admitted. For years after the Titanic discovery, Robert Ballard basked in the spotlight. He was the explorer who had brought the lost liner back from oblivion, the man who had shown the world haunting images of chandeliers, portholes, and rusticles in the black Atlantic depths. His fame was cemented, but as the years passed, Ballard began peeling back the layers of the story he had told in 1985, and what emerged shocked even longtime admirers. The truth was this: the Titanic expedition wasn't the whole mission, it was the cover story. In interviews decades later, Ballard admitted that his search for the Titanic had been possible only because of a secret deal with the U.S. Navy. Before the Titanic ever entered the picture, the Navy had tapped him to locate two nuclear submarines that had mysteriously sunk during the Cold War: USS Thresher, lost in 1963, and USS Scorpion, lost in 1968. These were not just wrecks. They were classified military sites carrying nuclear reactors and potentially sensitive weapons technology. The Navy wanted answers. Were the submarines leaking radiation? Could the Soviets have tampered with them? The public couldn't know, but the government desperately needed to. Ballard's deep-sea technology, particularly his remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, was perfect for the job. But a Navy search for sunken nuclear submarines in the middle of the Atlantic would have raised eyebrows. That's where Titanic came in. If Ballard succeeded, the world's attention would be squarely on the glamorous rediscovery of history's most famous shipwreck, not on the Navy's Cold War secrets. And that's exactly how it played out. Ballard completed the classified surveys of the submarines, and with the remaining time and resources, he located the Titanic. The Navy got the data it needed. Ballard got his glory, and the world was none the wiser. When Ballard finally admitted this, reactions were mixed. Some called it brilliant, a win-win scenario that allowed both history and national security to benefit. Others felt betrayed. They had believed Titanic's rediscovery was a pure act of science and determination, not a byproduct of Cold War maneuvering. But Ballard's admissions didn't stop there. He also revealed details about what he found at the wreck site that he hadn't initially shared with the public. While the haunting images of the ship's bow captivated the world, Ballard privately wrestled with what he considered gruesome realities. He avoided filming or releasing footage of certain areas where personal belongings, shoes, and even human remains suggested the raw human cost of the disaster. To Ballard, Titanic wasn't just a shipwreck, it was a mass grave. And part of his silence, he claimed, was respect for the dead. Yet critics questioned whether this restraint was truly about respect or about controlling the narrative. After all, Ballard was no stranger to publicity. He knew what kinds of images would shock and sell. By withholding some of the darker truths, did he sanitize Titanic for public consumption? Did he give the world a carefully edited version of the wreck, one that reinforced his heroic status while keeping the more disturbing realities out of sight? His later candor only deepened the controversy. He admitted that he had been deeply conflicted about the Titanic discovery from the start. On one hand, it was his crowning achievement, the discovery that made him a household name. On the other, he saw how quickly the site became commercialized, how salvagers turned it into a marketplace of relics, and how Hollywood eventually romanticized it into blockbuster melodrama. "I never brought anything up," he often repeated, framing himself as a protector of the ship's dignity. But the very act of finding Titanic had unleashed forces he couldn't control. That duality, hero and opportunist, scientist and showman, protector and exploiter, became the hallmark of Ballard's legacy. And when he admitted the truth about the Navy deal, the contradictions only grew sharper. Was he a man who used a Cold War cover story to achieve greatness? Or was he a pawn who got lucky in the shadow of geopolitics? Did he honor Titanic's dead? Or did he help turn their grave into a stage? Ballard himself seemed to wrestle with those questions. In later interviews, he struck a tone of weary honesty, as though unburdening himself before time ran out. Yes, he had used the Titanic to cloak a Navy mission. Yes, he had chosen not to show everything he saw. And yes, he had watched as his discovery spiraled into a cultural phenomenon he could neither steer nor stop. It wasn't quite a confession of guilt, but it was a rare glimpse behind the curtain. Ballard, the explorer who had once seemed larger than life, revealed himself to be human, driven by ambition, bound by compromise, and haunted by the consequences of his own success. And that revelation changes the Titanic story forever. It's no longer just about a ship lost and found. It's about the man who found it, the secrets he carried, and the uncomfortable truth that history's greatest discoveries are rarely as simple as they appear. The Titanic legacy in pop culture, Cameron, Exhibits, and the Ghost of 1912. By the mid-90s, Titanic fever had evolved into something Robert Ballard could never have predicted. His 1985 discovery had electrified the world, but what followed transformed the shipwreck into a global obsession. No longer confined to history books or the grainy footage from Ballard's submersibles, Titanic became pop culture's crown jewel, glamorous, tragic, and endlessly profitable. At the heart of this explosion was Hollywood. Director James Cameron, already known for blockbusters like Terminator and Aliens, became fixated on the Titanic story. His fascination wasn't academic, it was visceral. Cameron wanted to feel the wreck for himself, to look it in the eye. Using state-of-the-art submersibles, he conducted his own dives to the wreck site in the mid-90s, filming in dazzling clarity what Ballard had first revealed in ghostly black and white. These expeditions gave him the raw material and authenticity that would shape his magnum opus. In 1997, Cameron's Titanic hit theaters. It was part romance, part disaster film, part historical spectacle, and it became the highest-grossing movie of its time. For millions around the globe, it wasn't Ballard's footage that defined the Titanic. It was Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet on the bow, arms spread wide. The tragedy was transformed into a love story, complete with sweeping music, tearful goodbyes, and cinematic grandeur. Ballard had mixed feelings. On one hand, Cameron's work renewed public interest in Titanic, on a scale beyond anything he could have achieved. On the other, it blurred the lines between history and Hollywood fantasy. Ballard often reminded audiences that Titanic was a gravesite, not a backdrop for romance. Yet the movie's tidal wave of success dwarfed his warnings. Pop culture had claimed Titanic as its own. Meanwhile, exhibitions of Titanic artifacts began touring the world. Visitors lined up to see china plates, deck chairs, jewelry, and even pieces of the ship's hull pulled from the depths. These exhibits drew millions, generating enormous revenue and sparking heated debates. Were these displays acts of education, giving the public a tangible connection to history? Or were they desecrations, stripping a graveyard of its relics for profit? Ballard was vocal. He opposed the removal of artifacts. In his view, Titanic should remain untouched, a memorial to the lives lost. Yet, he couldn't stop the tide. Private companies, armed with legal claims and salvage rights, argued that the artifacts were better preserved in museums than left to decay under the ocean's crushing pressure. To many, the exhibits were the closest they'd ever come to touching history. To Ballard, they were looting, and still, the appetite grew. Documentaries flooded cable channels, books flew off shelves, and Titanic-themed merchandise, from posters to board games, poured into the market. Ballard's haunting images of the bow and the ship's skeleton-like remains were constantly repurposed, often stripped of the reverence he felt they deserved. In the frenzy of Titanic mania, the line between reverence and exploitation became hopelessly blurred. Yet, the cultural explosion also cemented Titanic as a modern myth. It wasn't just a story about a ship anymore, it was a parable about hubris, class, love, and death. Titanic symbolized human ambition colliding with nature's indifference, a reminder that technology and wealth could not guarantee survival. Ballard had unearthed the wreck, but Hollywood and pop culture had resurrected the story. This created a strange paradox for Ballard. On one hand, he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. His discovery had made Titanic immortal. On the other, he had lost control of the narrative. Cameron, the salvage companies, the media, they were now the custodians of Titanic's story. Ballard could only watch as his greatest achievement was repackaged, dramatized, and monetized in ways he never intended. Still, he remained the scientist in the shadows, the man who had actually touched the wreck long before DiCaprio set foot on a movie set. Ballard's credibility gave him a platform to critique, to warn, to remind the world that Titanic was real, not just a set piece, not just a love story, but a graveyard lying in the freezing Atlantic. And while his voice was sometimes drowned out by the din of pop culture, it carried a weight that Cameron's scripts and exhibitions could never fully match. The Titanic of 1912 sank in icy waters. The Titanic of 1985 rose again under Ballard's cameras. But the Titanic of 1997 and beyond became something else entirely. A cultural leviathan, forever embedded in collective memory, both glorified and commodified. And through it all, Ballard remained tethered to the ship, celebrated, criticized, respected, and resented. He had opened the door. What walked through was far larger than he ever imagined. Ballard thought the discovery would unite people. Instead, it sparked a fight that rages to this day. What happened after the cameras stopped rolling? A battle over Titanic's soul. The controversy over Titanic's grave. From the very beginning, Robert Ballard insisted the Titanic was not a treasure chest. It was a graveyard. More than 1,500 souls died in the freezing Atlantic that April night in 1912. And when he first set eyes on the wreck in 1985, he was struck not by gold or artifacts, but by shoes scattered in the silt. Each pair, he said, marked where a body had once been. For Ballard, Titanic was sacred. But that didn't stop the debate. Should Titanic be left alone, undisturbed in the darkness, or studied as one of the greatest archaeological sites of the modern age? Ballard argued for preservation. urging governments to protect the wreck under international law. He wanted no one disturbing it, no one profiting from it, and certainly no one plundering its artifacts. To me, he said, it's like walking into Arlington Cemetery with a shovel. Yet even Ballard's stance shifted over time. His documentaries, books, and speaking tours drew criticism from those who felt he was benefiting from tragedy while condemning others for doing the same. Some accused him of hypocrisy. Was selling TV rights and publishing bestsellers really that different from artifact salvagers who brought up china, jewelry, and ship fittings? To his critics, Ballard wanted to be the sole gatekeeper of Titanic's story. Supporters, however, defended him fiercely. They argued that Ballard never took objects from the site and that his films and lectures educated millions while keeping Titanic's memory alive with dignity. Without him, the ship might have been looted long before protective treaties were signed. His work, they said, was not exploitation, it was stewardship. The debate only deepened as technology advanced. Remote subs brought back crystal-clear images, museums displayed salvaged artifacts, and Titanic became both history lesson and tourist attraction. Some saw this as a grotesque commercialization of mass death. Others viewed it as necessary preservation before the ship vanished into rust and bacteria. Caught in the middle was Ballard. He wanted to preserve Titanic's sanctity, yet he also wanted to control its narrative. That tension between reverence and revelation defined his relationship with the wreck. To this day, the question lingers. Did Robert Ballard honor Titanic's dead, or did he help turn their resting place into a stage for profit and spectacle? We'd love to hear your answer and your thoughts, too. Write them in the section below, and for more videos and stories like this, click that subscribe button.